Now on Overnights,
I believe in reason and common sense.
Leith Van Onselen from Macro Business with the Treasury of Common Sense.
Common sense never goes out of style.
Morning, mate. How are you?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Phil. How about yourself?
I'm okay. So let's get to those two words to put a chill up in anybody's spine in the coalition, and that is net zero.
Yeah, mate. So the federal government, so talking to the Albanese government, they're expected to announce their 2035 emissions reduction target later today. And this is ahead of next week's United Nations General Assembly, which is going to be their meeting in New York. So they want to announce it ahead of that. And most people expect them to announce an emissions reduction target of between 65 and 75% by 2035. So we already had like a 43% emissions reduction target by 2030, and now they're going to increase that by 2035. It's probably more likely to come in more around 65% than 75%, but somewhere in that range. And on Monday, Shadow Home Affairs Minister Andrew Hastie from the Coalition, he threatened to quit the opposition front bench unless Coalition leader Susan Lee abandons the party's commitment to net zero emissions. And, on the face of it, you think that quitting the net zero policy would seem like a high-risk political move by the Coalition, because poll after poll has shown that there's, broad community support for climate change action from the Australian public, as well as around the world. There's 75% of people polled want Australia to do something on net zero, et cetera, et cetera. But here's the rub, Phil. When people are actually asked to nominate how much they're willing to pay for climate action, they basically go missing, right? So everyone says they care about it, but when they're actually asked to say, how much will you pay to do this stuff? That's when they sort of go back in a hole, right? In 2019, the ABC conducted a survey of ABC, viewers and readers and whatever. And what it showed is that 2/3 of people who were surveyed were willing to pay less than $500 per year, so less than $10 a week per year to combat climate change. And that's obviously, that was at the high end of that 2/3. There was, about 20-odd% who were willing to pay zero. And then there was, a range within that. And bearing in mind that this was a poll of ABC readers. So you'd think that given the leanings of the ABC, if you were to actually poll the general Australian population, you're probably going to get less than that. So the general population would be willing to pay less for climate change action, even though, 3/4 of people say they care about it. And a similar poll was conducted in the US, and that showed basically identical results. So it showed that most Americans are willing to pay less than $10 a week to combat climate change, even though when this poll was taken, Americans overwhelmingly supported climate change in theory. So it appears that most people virtue signal about the need for climate action, but they're not actually willing to pay for it. And this is where I think the Coalition can turn things around in the mind of voters. If they could communicate and explain to the Australian public the enormous costs of net zero, and they are enormous in terms of rising energy bills, the amount of subsidies that we have to pay through our taxes for this stuff, and the broader impacts on the economy, I think the Coalition actually will have a good story here. Now, in the short term, they'll take a hit in the polls, but let's be honest, they're not going to form government for a long time based on the polling at the moment. They're already in the doldrums anyway. But they could come up smelling like roses down the track once the cost of this net zero stuff starts actually bearing down on households, and we start paying for it in our bills, and we start having the economic fallout from it. And, my view is that for Australia to pursue a binding 2035 emissions reduction target is absolutely suicidal for the nation's economy. And across the globe, we've seen energy costs rise alongside the rise of wind and solar. So, just an example at home, South Australia generates about 3/4 of its power now from wind and solar, but it also has the most expensive electricity bills in the country. California in the United States, they're similar to South Australia. They are the leader in the United States in renewables, and they also have the most expensive power in the United States. This is a theme that's consistent throughout the world. As the share of wind and solar rises, electricity bills rise. And here's the other thing, that there is a practical reality here. Even if Australia went net zero tomorrow and we magically, produce zero emissions from tomorrow, it wouldn't have barely any impact, well, basically no impact at all on the world's climate, because Australia is only 1% of global emissions. So all of the hyperbolic doomsday predictions that we hear about climate change and everything, the world's going to end, etc., that would happen regardless to Australia, because we're not the ones driving this stuff. And the prime country that is driving these emissions, and there are others, but is China. So China alone accounts for nearly 1/3 of the world's carbon emissions. And it's also, because its carbon emissions have risen so quickly, it's also accounted for literally 2/3 of the increase in the world's carbon emissions between 2000 and 2023. Right? So the reason why the world's carbon emissions are rising is mainly because of China. China is the largest coal producer. So just to give some perspective on that, China produces 10 times more coal than Australia produces, right? So, at the same time as we're being told to get off coal, China is producing 10 times more coal. And we sold more coal to China to burn last year than we actually burnt ourselves. So China imports and consumes more coal than the rest of the world combined. China has installed more coal-fired electricity generation than the rest of the developed world has retired this century. And according to Statista, China has nearly 1,200 coal-fired power plants in operation versus Australia's 18. So China, and China is also expanding its coal capacity. So it's building more coal mines to actually mine more coal every year, as well as more coal-fired generators. So China's expanding more and more coal use every single year, while we're making ourselves, basically weaning ourselves off our own coal, even though and here's the real rub, Phil. Australia exports 7 times more coal than it consumes, a significant chunk of which goes to China. We also export 4 times more gas than we consume. China is one of our biggest consumers of gas. So my view is Andrew Hastie's right. Australia should abandon its net zero commitment, and we should instead give ourselves reliable and affordable power and use more of our own coal and gas here rather than selling it overseas for other countries to burn. So, the reality is, if Australia used a little bit more coal and gas itself to give itself cheap and, reliable energy, and exported a bit less gas, by pure arithmetic, if we use more and sold less overseas, the world's carbon emissions would be no different, right? But we could give ourselves cheaper power prices, cheaper gas, cheaper electricity, and that would obviously help with cost of living. It would make us a more competitive economy because we actually have a manufacturing sector that can compete because it'd have lower energy costs. And the cost of climate change are going to arrive regardless of what Australia does, because we're only 1% of global carbon emissions. Now, the alternative to this is to go down this path of, shutting down all the coal-fired generation and weaning ourselves off traditional sources of power while we still sell that stuff to the rest of the world, and instead go down this expensive renewables path, which is going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars to build out infrastructure and transmission lines, all these sorts of stuff, and then you've got to pay for battery storage and pumped hydro and all this kind of stuff. The costs are absolutely enormous, and they're going to drive up power bills. And once those power bills are driven up, it's going to increase costs and inflation across the entire economy, across the entire supply chain. And then what is left of Australia's manufacturing industry is going to shut down because it won't be able to compete. Its costs are going to rise. And ultimately, our manufacturing, what's left of it, is just going to move offshore to places like China while we sell coal and gas to China to burn instead of us. So whilst Australia is committing to this stuff, countries like China, India and the US, who all three countries account for more than half of the world's carbon emissions in a given year, they are not signatories to this stuff. So what are we doing here? Why are we going down this path? Why are we have abundance of coal, abundance of natural gas, abundance of uranium. We should be using this stuff ourselves to give ourselves cheap and reliable power. And then we'd have lower cost of living issues. We'd have a more diversified economy because we'd actually have manufacturing here because it'd be cheap to produce things because we have low energy costs. And we would have ultimately a more diversified and stable economy. So, ultimately, Phil, rationing energy use is a way to ration economic growth and ration living standards, and it'll ultimately result in a complete deindustrialisation of Australia. So that's the path we're going down. And I think Andrew Hastie and the coalition are right to dump this stuff and to basically say, look, we're not going to go down this road. This is suicidal from an economic perspective to go down here. And again, it makes absolutely no sense for Australia to sell 7 times more coal to the rest of the world than it uses itself and 4 times more gas, and then say, you know what, we've got to wean ourselves off this stuff. Because at the same time, we are selling these same things that we're denying ourselves to the rest of the world, namely to Asia. And all we're doing is we're basically providing them with cheaper energy while we're starving ourselves of cheap energy. And ultimately, that's just going to destroy our economy, and it's going to impoverish the nation. And I think this is why the coalition should dump net zero, and they're right to do so. And yes, they'll take a short-term reputational hit, but I think long-term they would come out on the right side of history, which is why they should do it.
Yeah. And as you say, virtue signalling has a lot to do with that too. Mate, where can people find the info about this?
Yeah, mate, they can go to macrobusiness.com.au.